necessarily make a lot of sense to you,
They look cool.
and so, but and I can go over them with him. I'll have a copy in the office also. There were a few. One little unexpected thing. This is a tendon right here. It's kind of frayed a little bit right in there.
That's the tendon that's frayed.
Kind of right there. Now like that's. This is the same tendon. See how kind of rounded that looks?
Yeah.
And as I kind of came down that way, see how that was kind of frayed?
Oh, yeah.
This is a ligament right here. It looks like it was rubbing against that ligament. Frankly, I don't think I've seen that before. Okay. Now, there are reasons why he may have that based on when we were examining him while he was asleep and so forth. But I don't think that's going to be an issue. But that does indicate he's been putting some stress on that area. And that could potentially create some discomfort with certain activities later on. So there's things we're going to do to kind of concentrate on that during his rehabilitation process. All right.
And is this in the shoulder that you operated on?
Yes,
right?
This is all in the shoulder.
Right. Okay. So is this a new thing?
No,
okay.
no. This is what we didn't see evidence of this on the MRI scan. Like MRI scans are great.
Yeah.
They don't show. There's false negatives. There's false positives. They don't show everything. Sometimes they show stuff that's really not the case. And
right.
And that is one of the issues in his shoulder. Is one of the reasons we went in there is to do what's called a posterior labral repair. And when we got in there, the labrum was not torn.
Oh.
Now, having said that, there were some abnormalities in that area, meaning that the ligaments in the back of the shoulder were a little bit loose compared to the front of the shoulder. And generally that usually indicates that the labrum is torn because the ligaments attached to the labrum.
Right.
So if they seem loose, usually that means they're not well attached. And it looked like they were not attached, but indeed they were, but they were just a little loose. All right. So we tightened those up, okay, to try and balance the front of the shoulder and the back of the shoulder. So the stability in the front and the back, we hope, is now about the same.
Right.
Instead of being too loose in the back, we've tightened it up to make it what we feel was kind of, physiologic, the way it's supposed to be.
Right.
Okay? And that was a plan, all right. And the plan was to repair the labrum, thinking that was why it was loose, but it turned out the ligaments were just kind of stretched out a little bit. So we kind of tightened them up, kind of like tucking in the waistband of your pants.
Right.
So that was where the MRI was a little bit misleading, but also indicating that there was some abnormal structural issues there, and so we rectified those. All right.
Okay.
The rotator cuff was definitely it was partially torn, not completely torn. That was also something that we anticipated based on the MRI scan, and when we put a needle through this is rotator cuff. When we put a needle through it, the needle just kind of fell through the rotator cuff. Whereas every other place we put needles through, his tissues were strong and tough. We had trouble getting them in there.
Pretty robust.
Even the case where we bent a wire.
K-wire.
You're kidding.
So we had to get another one.
I told Kris he was going to be thrilled to hear that.
So the other parts of the rotator cuff we had trouble getting through. This part I could just take the needle and just kind of almost drop it and it slid through. And we expected that based on his MRI scan.
Right.
And that kind of confirmed that the MRI scan was abnormal, and that was what, in my opinion, the main cause of his pain was this rotator cuff beginning to thin, and which means it's in the process of tearing. Okay?
Got it. So it hadn't torn, just so I can catch up.
So
it hadn't torn completely, but it was
There's
loosening up.
There was an interstitial tear, so there was a tear, but the top and the bottom of it were still intact.
Got it.
So it's just that the bulk of so when the rotator cuff was attached to the ball, the rotator cuff comes and attaches to the ball like that.
Yeah.
So we looked at the top, it looked okay. When we looked on the bottom, it looked okay. But everything in between was kind of not there.
Okay.
It was torn away. So you had just a little thin layer here and a little thin layer here. Eventually those would have pulled completely off, and that would be what we call a full thickness tear. Right? So he had what we call a partial thickness tear. And the options would be, okay, that we say, well, it's not completely torn, so let's just leave it alone and see how he does, right? And if he was 75 or 80 years old, that's what we would have done, right? But at his age now, with the demands he puts on his body and his shoulders, inevitably that would have kept tearing and probably and ultimately torn. So it almost looking like a rope hanging over the edge of the cliff where it's fraying and unraveling, and as long as there's still a strand there, everything's fine.
Right.
And once that strand breaks, then you've got nothing to. And I think it was just going to be a matter of time before that occurred. So what we did is essentially like took that frayed rope and cut all the frayed stuff away and put it back together. So all this rotator cuff that was attached here, but a lot of it was, we kind of cut that, cleaned all the bad stuff out of there, and then reattached it back to the bone.
Okay.
And we planned to do that.
Right.
Okay, and that is the part of the operation that's going to take the longest time to heal, and be the most problematic during his rehabilitation. When I say problematic, I mean not just that's what's not going to let him do the things he wants to do,
right?
Or that's what we're not going to let him do the things he wants to do because we're waiting for that to heal, right? So that to me was the main issue, the most likely thing causing most of his discomfort. Now that loose ligament was probably contributing to that.
Right.
When he would his shoulder would start to kind of piston out of or slide out of the socket because the ligament was too loose. That rotator cuff was bearing some of that stress, trying to hold it back in place, and that's probably why it was beginning to tear. Okay?
Right.
Now the final thing that we did is his AC joint up here, and I don't know if you knew much about that, but we had discussed that. He has injured that in the past. I think playing rugby is the way, and I think he's injured both of them. And this is a common thing, playing rugby, or in this country, American football is very common. And people, when they injure that joint, eventually that joint frequently becomes arthritic. And because when they injure, there's a disc of cartilage in there that protects it. And that disc of cartilage when they injure it often gets torn. And in his case, the majority of that disc of cartilage was missing. Okay, so what had happened is the bones were rubbing against each other. The ends of the bone were wearing down. That's what we generally term the term arthritis. That's what that usually means, and that can hurt. Okay, especially lifting weights.
Right.
So. In American football, it's very common because they land on their shoulders. When we operate on American football players for that, we do what we did with Kris, okay, where we actually cut the end of the collarbone off. I know it doesn't make sense, but we cut the end of the collarbone off so the bones aren't grinding against. We create a little gap in there, so when he moves around, they're not like that. And so in American football players, we do that not so they can play football. Okay, we do that so they can lift weights in the off season and get bigger. Because when that becomes arthritic, they have trouble lifting weights. Right. Okay? Especially doing bench presses. Now I know he doesn't do a lot of benching and stuff. That's not a high priority for him. But generally lifting weights is why we're doing this operation, not just because it hurts kind of thing. And so while we were there, we cut the end of the collarbone.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. So I know that sounds.
Yeah. What?
Sounds morbid, but it's not.
It's in many ways it's a very satisfying operation to the patient and the doctor.
I was gonna say.
Because there's nothing in surgery that works 100% of the time. Right? But that's an operation that works pretty close to 100% of the time. Okay. So we expect it to work.
Right.
So, and I talked about that with him.
Okay, like he was aware of that.
Yeah, and it was very clear. Initially, I think he was reluctant to do that.
Yeah.
He's known he's had these joints for years.
Yeah.
And he didn't think that was the main cause of his discomfort. But in the office, we did inject that or numb it up in the office. And he said that took about 40 or 50% of his pain away, which tells us that it was at least causing some of his pain. Okay. And so that was kind of the impetus or the reason to kind of proceed with that while we were there. Unfortunately, I've had patients over the years where I elected not to do that, and a year later I'm back in doing it. And I should have done that before, but they weren't hurting there before. So But we could see problems on the x-ray, and he had problems on the x-ray. And his MRI scan, the joint looked really bad, right? So when I showed his MRI scan to a couple of my partners, I go, hey, I'm debating about taking the other. They go, I'd take that thing out. I wouldn't leave that. I'd do something about that. Because the worry would be that we did all this other stuff and that would end up hurting him, and we'd be back here a year from now doing it. So that's what we did. We tightened up the joint capsule or the ligaments around the shoulder. We repaired the rotator cuff. We took out the end of his collarbone. Okay. There's also this bone up here on top also had a little bit of a lot of people term it a spur, but a little bit of a shape to it that rubs into the rotator cuff, and so we buried that off too. And that we plan to do that too. So that's all part of the procedure.
Right. Okay.
So we did everything we planned to do. And the majority of the shoulder looked like we expected. It's just that the labrum wasn't torn, or formally torn. Things were just loose back there, and so the MRI was a little mistaken there.
Right. Okay.
But we still addressed